Hello everyone. Coming up as my panellists come up on stage. My name's Jeremy Gill. I am the recently joined Head of Policy at the Committee for Sydney. And it's great to be facilitating the second of our panels today. We're talking about intergenerational challenges, but we also need to be talking about what some of the big ideas are to affect change. Big change does need big ideas, but big change also faces a number of barriers, and big change can rarely be affected over the long term by one group. Government, the private sector, individual communities, institutional groups are all part of driving change. I'm really excited to be joined today by three panellists who represent a really broad spectrum of who is making a change and who is really making impact in driving towards intergenerational equity. I have Deanne Stewart, the CEO of Aware Super, Rhonda Itaoui, who's the director of the Centre for Western Sydney at Western Sydney University, and Thomas Walker, who's the CEO of Think Forward, an organisation advocating for intergenerational change through policy. Please, could you make my three panel members welcome? What I'm really excited about in this panel is to explore how different groups, different institutions, different community groups are seeing the barriers, but also seeing where change can be made. Dan, I'm going to start with you, and I'm keen to understand how things are changing with regards to institutional investment, the placement of capital, the like. So my question is, what is institutional capital doing now through super funds and others to make Australia a more equitable place?
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Jeremy, and it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the invite. From a superannuation perspective, there is a lot going on behind the scenes, which I just thought I'd give you a sense of, both from the superannuation system itself, not assuming all of you are superannuation experts, but also where capital is being deployed and the role that I think superannuation can certainly play in part of this incredibly important topic. The superannuation system itself, for those of you who are not aware, today sits at about $3.5 trillion. To put it in perspective, that is the fourth largest pool of capital anywhere in the world as it comes to a pension system. So it punches above its weight by some margin, and it's on its way to about $6 trillion by 2030. Today, it's about 150% of GDP. So there is a lot of capital sitting there in the superannuation system. It's also one of the most tax-effective or tax-concessioned vehicles out there. So I start there in terms of its equity or being equitable in society and the role. While it's certainly regarded as one of the world-class pension systems, it's also got a little tinkering that needs to happen to make it more equitable. Give you an example of that, and that's certainly where we're an advocate for. About the top 20% of income get over 50% of the tax concessions. Or put another way, the bottom 30% of income, which are often our young, often women, get 4% of the tax concessions. So I start there by the equity of the system. Then I think really at the heart of your question is more, where is capital and where can superannuation or institutional investors be part of the solution from an equity perspective? And there's huge potential here. And it's happening probably right here, right now, right across the world. I'll give you a sense from an Aware Super perspective. We're one of the largest super funds here in Australia with over 170 billion. And we have really significant investments right behind some of our big investment themes that we think really help from a sustainable and intergenerational perspective. Why? Because ultimately, a member that joins us today at 17 years of age is probably not retiring until their 2070s. And so we have that very long-term lens, which is another benefit of the super system. So for us, investing in areas like the energy transition, climate change, is a huge opportunity for us. We invest significantly in renewables, in things like tilt renewables, Integra renewables, but also in sort of some of the up-and-coming emerging technology. We've founded an organisation called Birdwood, for example, that does distributed energy, or indeed we've invested in a number of battery storage type of companies. So there's a real role for institutional players to invest in this whole energy transition and the trillions of dollars that need to be invested in that. But I also think, and you heard the Minister just mention it earlier, there's a real role that superannuation and institutional investors can play in the housing affordability crisis that we're facing. And that's certainly something from an Aware Super perspective we have looked heavily at. Our goal is clear, to be one of the top performing funds and get the best possible returns. But at the same time, we've looked at, well, how can we be part of the solution? And we've invested up to $2 billion in build to rent and housing affordability, particularly in areas where essential workers work, because they are the heartland of our member base. And that I certainly think you'll see more and more super funds invest in, particularly if the tax settings and the incentives are there to make more in the affordable housing component. So that's the second area. And then the third that I'd say that I think really helps from an intergenerational equity is actually the amount of money that is now going from institutional investors into startups and scale-ups and those entrepreneurs that are so important to our economy. So just to give you examples of the type of companies that we've been either a founding investor or one of the first investors is companies that you'd recognise like Culture Amp and Canva, but actually some of the upcoming companies like Ruminate, for example, that do a synthetic kelp that reduces the methane from cows, or a company like Flavour It that does agri-tech that allows vegetable growers to grow with 50% less water. These are the things that we need now and into the future that I think you'll find institutional investors significantly behind, provided it has the right risk-return profile.
Thank you, Deanne. It's a fantastic spectrum of where investment's being placed, long-term renewables, emerging businesses that are going to be shaping the kind of the future industries of Australia, and also the big discussion today, particularly around housing, essential worker housing. I think that's fantastic. So we've talked about the role of capital, and Deanne also mentioned the need for equity in the system. A lot of your work is advocating to government, particularly the Commonwealth government, about what needs to change. What are the big changes that your organisation, and I guess others in the intergenerational advocacy space are advocating for government, and what's driving it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jeremy. At Think Forward, we advocate for intergenerational fairness or intergenerational care in policy making, particularly looking at our tax and transfer systems. And the way I like to talk about it is that we have a responsibility to leave Australia and Sydney better off than we found it. And I also like to look at the common stages of life, like can people get a high quality, affordable education? Can they find a secure, well-paid job? Can they buy a home? Can they build wealth? Can they get married? Can they have a family? All these sorts of common stages in life that most of us move through. And I would argue that a lot of those steps have been made a lot harder over the recent decades. And I think the tax and transfer system almost has like a really powerful but background role in that. So that's kind of what we study and research and advocate on. And so I guess another way we look at it is we live in a capitalist society. Some people are like, yay. Some other people are like, ooh, boo, that's bad. But what capitalism does is over time it accumulates wealth in certain parts of society. So we really need a strong tax and transfer system for pre-distribution, so making sure people can get an education, they can buy a home, they can start a business, basically so they can have a stake in the economy. And then there's sort of post-distribution, so making sure that we have a progressive tax system where people with higher incomes and wealth who can afford to contribute more, lift people from the bottom up, provide services for everyone. And I think we've been unpicking a lot of that over recent decades. And so that's what we're sort of advocating for, looking at how our tax and transfer system is benefiting the already wealthy over those starting out, and what reforms we need to do so we don't have an economic development strategy which seemingly is based on sort of rent-seeking and speculation and digging things up out of the ground and property investment and actually helping younger people have a stake in their economy.
Thanks, Tom. And obviously with super funds, there's members. With institutional capital, there's shareholders, there's voters, as we all are, to government. But who's talking to you, or who are you talking to collect that intergenerational view to take up to government in your conversations?
Yes, we have a couple of focuses. We're a participatory organisation, so we've just completed a survey of 1,000 millennials and Gen Z and getting their perspectives on the tax system. We were worried that young people wouldn't do a survey about tax, but they were actually really engaged and really interested, because things like billions of dollars going to property investors when they're stuck in a rental property really annoys them. And they're looking at their political leaders saying, oh, we'll just give you another $10,000 in a first home buyer grant, playing into the existing system and saying that that's not good enough. So we had a really strong response, and we have lots of younger people wanting to get involved in what we're doing. But then in terms of our advocacy, we're having a bit of success with the federal government. I've been sitting on the Federal Aged Care Task Force with Minister Wells, because she really wanted an intergenerational perspective. Allegra Spender's really pushing for structural tax reform, and been talking to her on her roundtable process, and even the Federal Treasurer's sort of wellbeing framework, including intergenerational thinking in that as well. And I know there's a lot of stuff going on at the New South Wales state government level that we've heard about today as well.
Thanks, Tom. Rhonda, I want to bring you in now. We've talked big macro trends, we've talked tax, we've talked the placement of super and long-term investments, but we know that the intergenerational equity, challenges around affordability, they're things that are playing out in individual lives, in households, in communities. And as we've seen in some of the previous presentations today, there's clear cultural, spatial, socioeconomic divides, even within Sydney. So with your work and research in and around Western Sydney, what are you seeing as the big ideas and innovations coming out of communities to make a positive difference for future generations?
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for providing the space to bring in the Western Sydney perspective. I think the topic of today's conversation will, of course, be centred in the Western Sydney region. So thank you. I was thinking about this question, and a number of organisations come to mind. There are some incredible organisations, community groups and individuals in the Western Sydney region that I'm incredibly fortunate to work with in my role at the university. And there are far too many to list out, but what I do think stands out to me are a few key attributes or approaches that are starting to shift the dial and make the transformation that we need to begin to see the change in the inequity that we record in parts of Western Sydney. And three key attributes really stand out to me. The first is that they're place-based, so they really pay attention to spatial divides beyond the Western Sydney versus the rest of Sydney approach that we've seen in the past. The second is that they're intersectional, in that they focus on the needs of specific diverse groups and hone in and target the needs of those communities and respond in ways that will address inequity in ways that are appropriate for those communities. And then the third is that they're collaborative, that these communities require working with multiple stakeholders, that it's not just on the communities themselves, but we need government, we need industry, we need universities, schools, and a whole range of stakeholders to work together in addressing those inequities. And we're really beginning to see some integrated approaches emerge throughout the region, and the university itself is a part of some of those solutions and those approaches. So the reason why those attributes, however, stand out to me really draws back to some of our work that we undertake at the Centre for Western Sydney on why place-based approaches in particular will be effective. So when we look at Western Sydney itself, what we find is we can look at two suburbs, like Fairfield and Parramatta, 6 kilometres apart. It's a really minimal distance. In one part of Western Sydney, in Fairfield, it's the most disadvantaged LGA in New South Wales. And then 6 kilometres down the road, Parramatta has some of the highest rates of education attainment in Sydney, almost on par with North Sydney. So the attention to that nuance and the finer grain divides is critical in developing the solutions that we truly need to address inequity. When we look at particular communities, however, as well, across those different geographical areas, what we find is there are a few key groups that face even deeper and entrenched inequities than across the Western Sydney area more broadly. So if we look, for example, women, we're doing some work at the centre that'll be released on International Women's Day on women's labour force participation in the region. And what we've found is, despite 140,000 women gaining a tertiary qualification in Western Sydney, 60% of them earn less than $800 a week. They're earning less than the minimum wage in the Western Sydney region. And despite them working the same amount of hours as women in the rest of Sydney, they're still earning less. So those inequities are particularly entrenched for women, and we see the same patterns across the city for Indigenous populations in Western Sydney. Our region is home to the largest Indigenous population in Australia, yet 6 out of 10 Indigenous residents are earning, again, below the minimum wage. And then a similar trend emerges for those that are speaking a language other than English. What we do know is, statistically, 70% of people will remain residing in the area that they're born in. So if we don't address those inequities based on place, based on the diverse needs of our communities and marginalised communities in need, those inequities will persist, and it starts as young as childcare, and it goes all the way through to the socioeconomic outcomes that we see in the region.
So it sounds like there's groups at a community level understanding what the challenges are and the desire to kind of build cultural and social cohesion in their communities, yet probably not the same groups able to build the infrastructure and really make those sort of big decisions to affect that change. What are those groups calling for from government and from the private sector to do that about connecting to opportunities?
Absolutely. So there's a key message that we hear among the stakeholders that we work with, the communities that we engage with, is firstly that they have the answers. They have really sophisticated responses and solutions developed for their communities based on decades and decades of work with their respective communities and their lived experience. They don't have the funding and the resources and the mechanisms to deliver what they do best. So a budget that's attached to an election cycle is not cutting it. A 4-year commitment will not address intergenerational inequity. It won't resolve decades and decades of inequities that these communities have faced, and it won't change the lives of individuals to provide a short-term program or solution. So we do have incredible expertise within the region. We have amazing programs that are being delivered, but they constantly sit in precarity, awaiting a budget cut, or they're not able to actually deliver the longitudinal, long-term and the holistic solutions that they know their communities require. The knowledge is there, the skills are all, they're all in our region. We just need the support and the resourcing, and the numbers speak for itself in terms of our investments per capita. But if we think about investments, based on need, we have a really long way to go, but we do have the mechanisms within our region ready to be unlocked once we invest our money where it needs to be.
Thanks, Rhonda. I want to talk about barriers now. A number of people in the audience have put in some questions who've obviously preempted my question to you, which is great. And tax has touched a nerve. We didn't think, Tom, potentially that tax was going to be such a big ticket item today. But the question I have to you is, the bigger the change, the bigger the barriers often that we face. What are you seeing as the biggest barriers to realising those changes? Deanne, I'm going to start with you.
Certainly from a superannuation perspective, if you look at some of the areas that I mentioned earlier, whether it be climate change, whether it be affordable housing, whether it be sort of scaling up, ultimately it comes down to risk and return. That's how an institutional investor thinks. And so when there is lack of policy or clarity of policy, what does that do? That adds huge risk. So you'll often see investors back away or go elsewhere for the capital that they have. And so certainly I would say up till now, particularly in the climate change arena, that sort of lack of real clarity of policy at a sector level has certainly been one of the aspects. So too has being able to get really transparent information from companies that allows you to compare one company to another in terms of determining where to invest the dollars. So for me, those issues are certainly being addressed, but that is sort of what has held back in Australia less investment in the energy transition than you've certainly seen in other countries elsewhere. So that's certainly one of them. The other side of it is the return equation, where I'd certainly say the ability to contribute really significantly to areas like affordable housing, as I mentioned. Once again, you've got the risk-return parameter. So for me, there's a lot of capital sitting in the system that could be deployed and put to work to really increase the supply of housing. But once again, you need to think about, if you want more of that to go to the affordable end, then there needs to be that commensurate incentive to do that. So there are examples that in each of the areas you've got massive capital sitting there, but often it comes down to the simplicity, the view of, is there too much risk because there's lack of clarity, or is there not enough return because there's way too much risk in the system?
Tom, just scrolling through a number of the questions from the floor, a lot of the questions are on what's the biggest break to tax reform? How do we affect tax reform? What are you saying to government when you're talking to them about what needs to change?
Well, it's using intergenerational frameworks and thinking about how capital and money is flowing around our economy and who it's benefiting. And so a lot of the work that we're doing is like, how do we flip the tax system so the rewards aren't flowing to the already wealthy who are investing in property or who are the mining companies, but are actually going to younger people who want to stake in the economy as well. So there's just the fact that wealthy people can pay less tax than a young person, particularly a young person with a HEX debt. For some reason, we load young people up with $50,000 worth of debt to start off their life, which doesn't seem very good to me. And then they struggle to buy a home, and then those things cascade through life and they fall further and further behind. So yeah, it's about thinking about how we flip or replumb our tax systems to help those people who are starting out, which is our young people. And even things like entrepreneurship, like the fact we have one of the lowest rates of entrepreneurship in the OECD, like something is seriously wrong there, that our young people don't feel confident to invent, to innovate, because they're worried about getting kicked out of their rental or how they can stay in their current precarious employment and all these kind of challenges that they face. It's about investing in young people at the start of their life, not throwing tax concessions and billions of dollars at older, wealthier people. And
what response are you getting in those conversations to government? Obviously, there's a reluctance often for substantive tax reform. What are you hearing back?
Yeah, look, it's a challenge because we don't want to get involved in intergenerational warfare. Like a lot of the time, people try and drag us into that, but we actually get a really good response from older people, from younger people, from politicians, and they sort of agree with what we're saying. But action is really hard. There seems to be a deficit of long-term thinking, bold policy-making, structural reform, and it's sort of reflected in the survey that we did that only 4% of the 1,000 Gen Zs and millennials we surveyed said that they had confidence that their leaders were thinking about the future and had a good long-term plan for the country. And 4%, that's shocking. Like, that's such a big problem that we need to overcome to sort of build up that faith again in sort of bold, long-term structural policy-making and reform.
Rhonda, what are some of the barriers you're seeing on the ground in terms of effecting meaningful change towards a more intergenerationally equitable community?
Yeah, reflecting on some of the barriers that we often hear from communities and, throughout some of our consultations across a whole range of issues and, and opportunities in Western Sydney, I'll probably summarise a few. The first would be the limited social infrastructure within the region. So especially thinking about how fast Western Sydney is growing, how diverse our populations are, inadequate schools, healthcare facilities, arts and culture facilities, and all the things that we might take for granted in other parts of the city that, for example, the pandemic really shed light on, like access to green and blue spaces. All the components that makes a city livable is one of the kind of key barriers that are standing in the way of true equity in the region. The second, and I'm separating this out from the other infrastructures I've mentioned, but it's so critical, is transport and connectivity. With a sprawled city like Sydney, residents in Western Sydney are facing spatial barriers to access employment. And what we find, especially in our work with women, is women are disproportionately impacted by that spatial barrier. travelling 3 hours a day for some women in our region to access their job that refuses to provide very reasonable flexibility to work from home while juggling childcare responsibilities that fall on a woman predominantly is simply unfair and is feeding into the inequities that we see when we're citing that 60% of women are earning under $800 a week. So there's kind of some key spatial barriers that come into play. The third one that's a critical one that the pandemic again shed to light was the issues with digital connectivity and digital exclusion, and how internet that we pay for and digital devices can further entrench some of these inequities for groups that can't afford a laptop. Some of our work in New South Wales schools found that households of up to 4 children were sharing one laptop, and the ripple effects on education from those experiences during the lockdowns will be effects that we see over the years and for many years to come unless we rectify that. The fourth really relates to our diverse populations. Language barriers are one cited common issue that has been cited in some of the communities that we're working with, but also limited recognition of overseas qualifications. We have dentists and engineers who can't find work in Western Sydney or can't find work in our city. And then we talk about a labour shortage and that we don't have talent in our city, but we have a wealth of talent ready to work, but we don't have the structures in place to enable that participation to the economy. And finally, the biggest one is an inadequate investment and inadequate and inequitable funding structures. So as I mentioned earlier, the per capita funding that Western Sydney receives across a whole range of opportunities does not match our population. It's disproportionately concentrated in the rest of Sydney. But also what we hear from our stakeholders is that the funding processes to even be awarded a grant are so restrictive and prohibitive and really difficult for some of the grassroots organisations that are doing great work to be able to tap into. So those are some of the key barriers overall, but the investment in the community and investment in community-led solutions just comes up time and time again and has a lot of potential for us to start to shift the dial in the region if we do work with these organisations.
Thank you. We're coming up to time remarkably fast. This has been a fantastic conversation. Just to draw on some of the questions that are coming from the audience, if you had one thing that you could do, either individually, professionally, or through the sector that you work in, what do you think is one of the big changes that we can make to get real bang for buck in shifting the dial? Deanne?
Oh, it's hard just to say one.
I know.
I'm going to give one for the different cohorts in this room. I think one, if your government is these policies and incentives really matter if you really want to move the dial in some of these equity and to really go deep in the policy and the incentives with the various stakeholders. You've just heard from 3 different stakeholders. For those of you who are employers in the room, I think we have such a responsibility to make sure from an equity perspective that from an intergenerational perspective at both sides, I would say both the young coming up have a voice within the organisation. We have different sort of focus groups and ways to make sure that we've got a very different view, but also I'd say at the other end, in terms of ageing and the workforce, that is something we have to face into. And then finally, I would say for everyone who is not in those 2 categories, vote with your feet. You know, if you think about, for example, in the superannuation world, you can vote to actually move into a more socially conscious super fund, for example, or within your own super fund in a more socially conscious option. These things really matter, and it's the biggest pool of capital in Australia.
Thank you. Tom, what would you do?
Well, I think positively the days of don't eat so much smashed avocado and just work harder and you'll be fine are behind us. And I think the fact that we've got this theme today, this event, lots of people have recognised that we have this intergenerational issue across lots of our different policy areas. So I think the fact that that recognition is now there is really exciting. I think younger generations, although they're worried about the future, they have these beautiful values around community and collective well-being, and I think that's such a strong base for us to be reformists and refresh a lot of our big economic systems for the next 2, 3, 4 decades going forward. So that's what I hope to see, that working together, being positive, thinking about a better future and how we restructure and refresh our systems, because that's really important.
Thanks, Tom. Rhonda.
Beautiful. So many things I could list, but I think if I was to select one, and it's based on some of the work that we're really diving into in developing an economic plan for Western Sydney, is the importance of high quality jobs in Western Sydney. The geographical centre of Sydney is in Auburn. It is not in the parts of Sydney where most of the jobs are located. 48% of our workforce is sourced from Western Sydney, and requiring residents to travel for hours to access employment just isn't fair. We have an incredible talent base to tap into, and whether you're an employer, a policymaker, you're an employee in an organisation, thinking about ways to draw on that talent base and create the inclusive workplaces that are required for our diverse populations as well can make strides in addressing those inequities and beginning to shift the dial on those the incomes that I cited earlier.
Thank you. We're out of time now. I think what I took away a lot from that conversation, think long term, not short term. Provide policy certainty for investors and other sectors, and give voices of all groups an equal say in decision making. What a great conversation. Can you all please join me in thanking Deanne Stewart, Rhonda Itaoui and Thomas Walker. Thank you.